Well, Poddies, it is Friday, and it is the Friday post my birthday, which is very exciting because it means as I am coming to you, I've officially now had a week of being 30. Dun, dun, dun. I can't wait to actually batch the next load of episodes after my birthday because I'll be able to tell you what happened. And right now I'm in this kind of state of limbo where I'm like, oh, I bet it was amazing, but I have no idea what happened. I have no idea what I did. So consider me very happy about being 30. Consider me having celebrated for an entire week, hitting my 30th birthday. That is always a very, very good start. But, you know, also a little bit terrifying. Terrifying to be 30. Terrifying to be 30, to officially be, you know, old. I feel like I'm actually a grown-up, which is a little bit scary. A little bit scary. So I'm diving into this Friday with one of my favorite episodes that I think I've recorded yet. And that's a very big claim, okay? It's really interesting for me because we record, or I get to record, so many interesting conversations and I get so excited about them. And I've had so many favorites over the last 2 years. Can you believe that? 2 years of the podcast? Oh my goodness. But this is a standout episode for me. Super, super excited to introduce you to the lovely Leslie Gold, who is joining us on the episode today. Formerly known as the Radio Chick, Leslie has worked in radio and actually said very nicely that our podcast, you know, mine, yours, Scott's, it's a team effort, right, Poddies? Is one of the best produced that she has heard. And that just made me so incredibly happy. Now, the conversation that we've had today is super interesting. It's all about the art of persuasion, which is very exciting. And it's all about how to ethically persuade, what that looks like. And actually, we had some really, really interesting insights around Leslie's journey to where she is today, moving from being a radio presenter, a very successful radio presenter, taking her show from being number 3 on the airwaves, and how she actually went through that journey. And I want to be clear, there were some very big obstacles to overcome. And this was in the days before social media. So I want you to listen to this episode and be really thinking about the power of relationships and, you know, the power of the people, as it were. That sounds very 60s hippie, doesn't it? The power of the people. But that is exactly how Leslie's journey kind of shifted and transformed into where she is today, teaching people how to use the powers of persuasion in order to excel in their industry. Now, talking about the powers of persuasion, consider this my, 10-minute moment or 10-minute lifeline or deadline or however you want to phrase it, to let you know that the spaces for Evolve are closing soon. So if you haven't sent in your application yet, if you haven't gone and checked it out and you're thinking, this is the year that I want to take my business to that next level. We are in September. I want to make the next 3 months the very best of 2019 and then have the very best 2020 that I can. Please know that now is the time to apply. Now, I don't say this lightly. You know, I think applying for a space on a program is always difficult. You know, not only do we worry about the fact that, oh my God, I have to fill out this application form and what if Jess hates my answers? Spoiler alert, I won't. But we also then have to think about, you know, this is applying to invest in myself, and that can be really scary. But what I do want to say, because we've had lots of emails over the last few weeks, is that nothing changes unless you do. So when you're listening to this episode today, you know, you'll hear how Leslie changed, how I have changed, the changes that we all make in order to transform and to shift and to go further in our lives, in our businesses. And I wanted to really hone in on that today. If you want your business to change, I don't particularly care if you invest with me or with anyone else who's going to take your business to that next level, but please know that it is going to be necessary. This market is changing, it's shifting. We've been talking about it all year. And if you don't want to be behind the curve, if you genuinely want to be a business that does survive, that does have the best end to 2019, that does go into 2020, feeling prepared, becoming that standout thought leader in your industry, making money easily, generating leads, having a great audience, you know, and really using those 4 pillars that we talk about in Evolve of thought leadership, of sales, of marketing, and most importantly, balance, so that you create the business that you actually want. So if you are interested in doing that, please know that this is going to be one of the final opportunities to go and grab yourself a spot and Evolve, or at least apply for one. If it's not the right fit, I will tell you and I will refer you to another resource, either of mine or somebody else's, that I feel is a better fit for where you are now. Okay. But if you are somebody who's thinking, yes, I need to step my income level up a gear, actually I want to step back from doing everything all of the time, and I want to figure out a more balanced and profitable way to run my business, then you need to jump into Evolve. Now, I'm going to let you crack on with this episode from the lovely Leslie Gold. It honestly is fabulous. I have gone back and re-listened a couple of times, and I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I enjoyed recording it. I'll see you in the next episode. So Poddies, I am really excited about this one. There are two reasons I'm excited. One is that I have an epic guest. Welcome, Leslie Gold. It's so great to have you here today.
I'm so excited to be with you, Jessica.
I'm so excited because the second reason is that I get to say something super American about you and your website.
Uh-oh.
On the website. Because I'm British, I sound terrible when I say certain words that I deem like American words. But you have this awesome website, theradiochick.com. And I was like, oh, I get to say chick on the podcast. And that never happens for me.
Oh, that's hilarious.
So
Oh, I'm really glad to be here. Yeah, I was a radio talk show host for 15 years in New York City. And then eventually I was heard nationally in the US. And my moniker and the name of the show was The Radio Chick. And there is a certain tongue in cheek with that as well. I was taking myself not too seriously, but at the time, my job was to deliver young men to the station, men age 18 to 34. And so that also informed the name of the show and then some of the more controversial bits we did on the air.
Oh, I love that. That's so exciting. It must be so cool to be on radio. And now you're on a podcast, which is basically the same thing, except not live. So therefore not as scary.
I think in a lot of ways, podcast is superior to radio. I really enjoy podcasts. When I was on the air, there was a certain theater of mind that we created. I had an ensemble, if you will. I was the head of the show, but I had an on-air sidekick who's a brilliant comedian and also an on-air producer who added comedy as well to it. And we created theater of the mind. And to a large degree, that and storytelling is what made the show so wildly successful. What podcasts do brilliantly is that same thing. They tell a story, right? You get into a story of either a tragedy or somebody's life trajectory. And their sound usually. Sometimes these podcasts are very ambitious and they go out on location. And it's almost like a movie without the video, without the visuals. And so podcast, I think, taps into what radio used to be at the very beginning of radio, before people had television, and got all their storytelling and all their entertaining off of audio only.
I love that. It's so interesting, isn't it, how times change? And I love that you've taken the work that you did on radio and you've kind of moved it ahead into a more advanced, I don't know, is it piece of life? Is that what we call business? Piece of life now?
Well, what I do now is I teach persuasion. I teach business people and professionals and entire organizations in some cases how to be more persuasive. And a lot of that I learned from being on the air for 15 years as the radio chick. When I was the radio chick, you can say it as much as you want, by the way.
I'm going to be so excited. That's all you're going to hear this episode, guys.
Right. I went from being a complete unknown in the city to having over 1 million listeners every day. And it was not just the number, it was a rabid, hardcore million. And prior to being a radio host, I owned and ran a window manufacturing company, which had 165 employees. I was a young woman at the time. I was 26 years old when I borrowed $5 million from the bank to let me buy that company. And that alone was an exercise in persuasion. But those 165 employees were almost all men, and almost all older than I was as well. My employees were men because it was a manufacturing company. My customers as well were male because it was allied to the construction field, which is, of course, is male dominated. And when I sold that company, I sold it to a Fortune 100 company, and that's when I went into radio. So when it came time to tie this all together, when it came time for the next chapter in my life, I thought about, well, I've got these seemingly disparate experiences, radio and window manufacturing, but I enjoyed both. And in many ways, I excelled at both. And I thought, what is the unifying thread? What is it I can sort of offer the world in service that I really know now that I've had more than a few years on this earth? And I realized that it was persuasion, and that I had something that was tied all my experiences together. And that certainly is what helped make them successful. And that was, I thought, something valuable that I could teach.
I really like that. And it's so interesting because I think when we initially hear the word persuasion, especially now, we can think of the connotations like unethical. I think that's something that's come up because we've seen so many, Wolf of Wall Street-esque salespeople out there. We've seen politicians recently run campaigns that have been incredibly persuasive, but not necessarily best fit or best played. And I think that it gets a bad rap. It is like sales in that way. Do you feel that?
Well, for sure. I don't view persuasion as being unethical. You can use it unethically, but you shouldn't. Persuasion is just the lifeblood of business. Customers have to be persuaded or convinced to buy your product. There's nothing malevolent about that. Investors have to be convinced to buy into a company or buy a company's stock, or at least not sell it. Clients, if you have got clients, Jessica, they have to be convinced to go along with your recommendations. I'm sure your recommendations are not nefarious or malevolent as well. And even if you work in a company, working internally, your colleagues have to be convinced to go along with your plan. I teach people to be more personally persuasive. I don't teach marketing. I don't teach PR. I don't teach influencing on social media, although they all do employ elements of persuasion. I'm talking about the critical moments when you need to excel, a critical presentation, when you're in front of customers or clients or investors or your board of directors or your employees in a time of crisis, and you're not doing anything, what's the word I want? You're not misleading anyone. You just have to get people to buy into your vision.
I really like that phrase, the buy into your vision piece, because I think that's when we think about persuading, often we can think of it almost like sales in that it's the hard sell. We're trying to convince, we're trying to force people, we're trying to make them make the decision that we want to make. And I think there's a lot to be said for being able to do that in a way that helps people come to the best decision, because sometimes the customer doesn't know what the best decision is for them until they've got all the information laid out there. And I think sometimes the mistake that certainly I see people making in the business world when it comes to sales is they're so desperate not to be sleazy or pushy that they forget that actually persuasion is okay. It's okay to be positive about your product or your service. It's okay to be enthused about it. Would you say that those are elements of persuasion?
They certainly are, but I would say that persuasion starts with storytelling. There is no better way to persuade someone to your point of view than to marry an idea with an emotion. And the best way to do that is with a story. People don't buy in, if you will, from data. Data's okay. Data is, and facts are useful, but if you really want to spur your audience, whoever it may be, to action, in order to get them to do something, they have to feel something. And the way to do that, the best way to do that is with a story. And I teach storytelling for business. You can tell an effective story in 40 seconds if you know how to do it. It doesn't have to be a long, drawn-out affair. Or you can, if you're really a master, you can really weave a story that frames your audience's point of view and leads them where you want to take them. The best way to be persuasive is with a story. I came by, if I can, I'll tell you a story. I came by my hardcore belief in storytelling rather organically. I mentioned I was a radio talk show host. So for the first 2 years, I was in Boston in the United States, and all the rest were in New York City. And I really couldn't believe my good luck that I got a job in New York City. It's the #1 market here in the US after just 2 years. And as I mentioned to you before, my job was to deliver young men to the station, men aged 18 to 34. So we named the show the Radio Chick Show and invented these bits, antics, if you will, that I thought would appeal to this audience. And I'll caution you before you judge that it was a different time, but it was bits like 20 questions with a hooker,
Ooh.
or the vaginal psychic, or the wheel of puke, things like that. Again, this was a very different time. It was before any social media. Just to give you a frame of reference, MySpace wasn't even invented yet. And as far as social consciousness goes, forget it. We were light years away from either #MeToo or #TimesUp. So these outrageous bits, we call them bits in the radio business, I felt were the pillars of the show. I thought that's what we were building the show on. Little by little, the show was getting traction. In between the bits, I would tell stories, we would analyze the news, we would discuss our lives. The ratings began to move. First quarter, we were 21st, next 17th, next 9th, then 5th. We were 5th in the market. I felt incredible. I had a top 5 show and had over 1 million listeners, and we were being written about by the New York press. Listeners were spontaneously engaging, doing insane things in homage to the show, like hanging 150-foot banners off the Triborough Bridge, which is a large bridge in New York, and getting arrested for it. And I would leave the station every day exhilarated. I couldn't believe someone paid me to do this job. I would have paid them to let me do it. And when the show reached 5th in the ratings, my boss marched a bottle of champagne into the studio while we were on the air, all smiles. A short 3 months later, when we were just about to hit, 2 days before we were about to hit 3rd in the market, he fired me.
Wow.
And I'll tell you, I didn't see that coming. It wasn't from an incident. I'd not been disciplined for any reason. He told me that they were bringing in a team from his old station in Washington, D.C., who, in his judgment, would be a better fit for the station. And his judgment counts. So that was it. I was fired, and so was my team. Stunned would be an understatement. I mean, the worst part about it, Jessica, was it totally gutted everything I thought I knew about myself. I mean, in my mind, I wasn't the kind of person people fired. I was the kind of person people fought to keep. So I did the only logical thing. I stayed in bed every day and ate Haagen-Dazs in the dark.
That is a good way to spend some time where you're feeling a little bit delicate.
Right. Day after day, I never got dressed. I wore the same Pussycat Doll sweatpants every day, so that will date me as well. I really had to stay in the sweatpants after all that Haagen-Dazs. I was still under contract, so I was going to get paid for a while to sit and pig out in my pajamas, but that was really no solace to me. So in this pig out period, a listener reached out to me. Her nickname from the show was Joyce from Under the Console. I'll let you draw your own conclusions. Joyce informed me that she was going to organize a letter writing campaign to my boss, CBS Radio, to object to my firing. And I remember thinking, oh, that's so cute. That'll never work, right? And I stuck my spoon back into the ice cream. But even though it was the early days of the internet, Joyce somehow organized a rather consequential letter writing campaign. And all the letters were written to Mel Karmazin. He was the head of CBS Radio. I had not met Mel Karmazin. He was far too many levels above me. But when the 10,000th physical envelope crossed the threshold of his office, he took notice. And he called my boss and said, wait a minute, my old boss, wait a minute. You fired her at third, and we're still paying her? Bring her back. And so mine and my team were brought back. I won't tell you it wasn't awkward. It was like a mob hit gone bad. Like we knew we weren't wanted at the station by our boss, and not seemingly his boss as well, because he had signed off on our firing. But the listeners made me feel loved. And here's the point about the storytelling. My first day back on the air after returning from being fired for several weeks, I opened the mic for the first time and I said, all of you who wrote a letter, all 10,000 or so of you who bothered, what made you want to bring us back? And I expected to hear, it was about the antics. I expected to hear, oh, it was the flaming stripper barbecue that you did. But instead, what I heard was Chick, which is what they called me. Chick, the day you told the story of how you had to put your dog to sleep, I sat in my car and I cried like a baby. Or Chick, the day you told the story of your father desperately trying to set you up with his podiatrist son, I laughed so hard I spilled coffee down my shirt. It was the storytelling. I didn't even know what my own show was built on. But that, I was astounded to learn that. But that's what made my listeners, that large body of listeners, feel so connected and invested in the show. Storytelling literally saved my career. But moreover, that was the day I realized what a powerful tool storytelling could be, and how the use of good imagery could be so important for you, and how you can move an audience of 1 or 1 million with the right story. And I knew all my stories weren't so great at the time, so I began to analyze what made certain stories work and which didn't. First of all, so I could replicate it on the air. Today, I know, and today I can teach it. And that's how I got my rock solid belief in storytelling. I know in my brain and my heart and my gut that storytelling works, because it had such an important impact on my own life and career.
Wow. That's crazy, isn't it? I can't believe, like, even if we take it back to the story about getting fired, that's a really powerful thing for your listeners to know that they played a part in it. It becomes part of their story.
It was absolutely their story. I had given up, right? I was in the dark in my sweatpants. I had given up. I hadn't even regrouped yet to figure out what my next move was. I was just very busy feeling sorry for myself, but they organized and they did it because they felt connected to me personally, even though, of course, I had not met my 1 million listeners. And the connection was through the storytelling.
It's just incredible. I think you have to give people that partnership. And that's what you did. And that's what I really love about that, is that, you know, they were partners in your story. It wasn't just you telling them something or you imparting wisdom, which I think is what we see a lot, right? Everyone wants to teach people and educate them and be informative, particularly when we're trying to sell stuff. But what you did was bring them into your world.
Right.
And they felt like you were part of it.
Yeah. So let me jump now to how it can be used in business, maybe how this storytelling can be used for selling, just what you brought up. So there's a number of stories that you can tell in business. You can tell a patron saint story. You can tell a founder story if you're talking about the origin, an inspirational story about the origin of your company or the person who did found your company. There can be client stories, but one of the best that can be told in a business setting is a character story. And if you'll allow me, I'll give an example. I was hired by an insurance company to work with their agents on upping their persuasion game. And I thought, ugh, puke, insurance. Like, this is going to be so tedious, right? And you think about most people's interaction where they're insurance agents, it's mostly about finding you the right coverage or sending you a check when your pipe bursts in your house, neither of which is compelling storytelling material. But there was one agent, and he was a real challenge. And all his stories were lame, to be honest with you. They were all about coverage. So, you know, they were about including coverage for mold or something. It was terrible. So we broke for lunch during this workshop. And during lunch, he just offhandedly told me a story about a customer that he had that lived in New Jersey, which is on the East Coast of the United States. This customer had the love letters his grandpa sent his grandma when his grandpa was over in Europe fighting World War II. And the grandson, now an adult, wanted to insure the letters. But what's the value, right? They have no value to anyone else. But to the grandson, they're priceless. Still, no amount of money could ever replace those letters if they were lost. So this insurance agent says to him, you know what? The letters really can't be replaced with a check. So don't waste your money insuring them. I don't want to take your money for that. Just keep them safe and treasure them. But that's not where the story ends. So I don't know, a half dozen years later, Hurricane Sandy is bearing down on the east coast of the US. Hurricane Sandy was a monster hurricane. It was one of the deadliest and most destructive hurricanes ever to come out of the Atlantic. I think it was the largest Atlantic hurricane on record. So the agent is busy proactively calling out to his customers. Listen, you may have a claim. Here's the number you call. Here's the kind of information you'll need. I hope you don't have a claim, but here's what you do. He's being a good agent. So he calls the adult grandson, who's frantically packing up his family and the pets and putting them in the car with the computers, and they're about to evacuate. And the insurance agent says, oh, hey, don't forget your grandpa's letters. Oh my God, thank you so much, says the grandson. He runs to get them. He packs them in the car before he drives off. I said to the agent, that's your story. He said, but it has nothing to do with coverage. I said, but that's your character story. That story tells me that you're a guy who remembers and cares, even when it has no direct effect on his business. That makes me want to do business with you, irrespective of cost and coverage. And that's one of the strongest types of stories that you can tell in business, a character story.
I really love that. And I think it's everyone can relate to somebody else experiencing a problem or a win, or it makes such a difference, because I think a lot of people, particularly in the online world, people feel very isolated a lot of the time. So actually knowing that there is somebody else out there who is having your experience, or who has been through it, or who's overcome it, it makes such a huge difference. And you forget that that's persuasive, because you're so used to just doing it naturally. That's what kids do at school, isn't it?
I mean, our whole society is really built on storytelling in one way or the other. It's one of the oldest art forms that we had. When the cavemen sat around the fire, they figured out a way to tell the story of the day. But the reason that makes it powerful is just what you say, right? You can relate to something. There's an emotion there with which you can identify, right? Whether the story is about a treasured family heirloom, like we're talking about with this, or being nervous in an interview, or whether the story is about why you are the right person for the assignment you got because it taps into your enthusiasm and something that happened to you long ago. Whatever it is, it's the marrying of the emotion with the narrative that makes the story powerful. And there has to be a moral to the story as well. That's the difference between stories that you tell your friends and stories that you tell in business. The ones you tell in business have to have, today they call it a controlling idea. In the old days, they called it a moral. I'm old, so I'm going to call it the moral of the story. But it's the takeaway. It's the lesson that you want your audience to remember when they think back on the story. And that moral, if you will, must be articulated by you to leave no question as to what the point of the story is when you're telling it. And that's the difference between the stories that are crafted correctly for business and the stories you just tell your friends when you're on the phone with them.
I really like that. That's so important. And I think it gives people a much more natural way to sell. It gives them a much more natural way to do it, because I think, so often we look at what are the 10 steps to landing a client, or these things. And we think of it in a very practical point A, point B perspective. And I think there's a lot to be said, particularly for women who are sometimes less linear about the way that they want to proceed, and often the ones who are focused more around not wanting to be pushy or sleazy, actually having that art of just gently sharing with people, especially if they've got a product or service that's doing incredibly well. Why wouldn't you want to share how it's impacted somebody else, and giving that story each day?
I'm so glad you mentioned that. I do, when I'm in front of a group of women, I do a special section on communicating while female. And it's maybe one of the more controversial sections I do, because women feel that it's not fair that they're judged a certain way that men aren't. And men can discover the cure for foot fungus and they'll present it like they discovered the cure for cancer. Women can discover the cure for cancer and present it like she's sorry she bothered you, And so So people, when I talk to women, it's people bristle at the unfairness of it, but my gig isn't fairness. My gig is persuasion. And from the prism of persuasion, there's a lot to learn from the way men communicate. Not necessarily, you don't borrow everything because it doesn't always work for women, but there is a lot to learn from it. And women need to learn how to take up space when they're physically speaking and stand rooted and erect, to speak slower and practice lowering their voice, especially if they have a tendency towards shrillness. Women are natural storytellers, but they put in too many extraneous, as a rule, not all, but they put in too many extraneous details. So when telling a story, especially to a group of men or mostly men, you need to shorten it and take out everything extraneous. To stop reflexively apologizing. You know, a woman will open her window in the middle of the night and say, I'm sorry, but could you please turn that music down? Why is she sorry, right? I do it myself and I teach this stuff. I'll pick up the phone and I'll say, I'm sorry, couldn't take your call. I was on the other line. Why am I sorry? I wasn't expecting their call. So we have a reflexive apologizing gene in us, and it presents as weakness sometimes. And we use watery words a lot of times. We say like, oh, I just want to say, or I feel like that's not a good idea, or even something politely deferential like, correct me if I'm wrong. But you say, correct me if I'm wrong, you invite someone to do just that, and then they jump in and they take control of the conversation.
So it's so interesting that you mentioned that, because I think, who was it? Was it Mel Robbins who recently wrote an article about not saying sorry? And she said, you know, and she gave like 10, I think it was 10 examples of environments where women would typically say that they were sorry. So things like walking into a meeting late and people would apologize. And she said, you need to, as women, turn your apologies into thank yous. Thank you for waiting for me. Thank you for doing X, Y, Z. And I thought that was so interesting. I mean, I'm British, so I would never be late for a meeting because it really bugs me. But I think that's a Brit thing, not a female thing. And it was so interesting to think about the reframe of women stepping up and being more assertive in a non-pushy way.
That's right.
Instead of being apologetic about their just being there.
If you find yourself saying, I'm sorry to bother you, to your boss, they're your boss. It's their job to dialogue with you. And men do this instinctively, Jessica. I remember being at meeting a group of friends for dinner. There were 8 of us, 7 of us arrived on time. I'm like you, I'm compulsively on time. And the one that was late was a man. And so the group was waiting about 20, 25 minutes before he showed up, and we were hungry. So when he finally came, a collective wail went up at the table. Oh, look who's here. Oh, we can finally eat. And he sat down at the table, and I happened to have the empty seat next to me. And missing the apology I thought we deserved, I turned to him and said, dude, you're 25 minutes late. And he went, yeah, thanks for waiting. Right? And that was it, right? That was the end of it. And I thought men just do that, right? They don't even apologize when they should. So there's a big space in there in the apology space. And you need to find yourself in the right section of it. I have a prescription. If you are a reflexive apologizer as a woman and you don't want to be, I have a great way to kill it.
Ooh, I love it.
Go to a trade show, a really busy trade show. So it's very crowded and people are walking in the aisles and they stop dead to look at what's happening in this booth or that booth, and everybody is bumping into everyone or having to move around. And so people will bump into you, you will bump into them, and you will hear yourself how often you say, oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Oh, right. Excuse me. Sorry. Right. Because you bumped in or they've bumped into you. Once you get a sense for that, my challenge is to stay at the trade show and spend the rest of the day saying anything other than I'm sorry, like after you, or, oh, there's so many people here, there's so much to look at. Whatever you have to say other than saying sorry. you will cut your reflexive apologizing habit down by about 90% in that one day.
I'm going to try that. That is something. As a Brit, I do say all the time, if I accidentally bump into somebody, I'm like, oh, sorry. Airports are a nightmare.
Well, I mean, the Brits are just naturally more polite as a society than we Americans are. You know, we're total pigs. So
well, I wasn't going to say. I think that's always a little uncomfortable. But no, I really love that perspective on it. And I think as well, it's so interesting and refreshing actually to hear somebody talk about persuasion, particularly for when we look at it in relation to women, and it not being, here's the art of persuasion to get a man, because that's what we hear so often as women. That's what society kind of teaches us about persuasion is, if you're a woman and you need to persuade somebody, it's going to be a man for whatever reason, to fall in love with you, to do something for you. And so actually it's really nice to hear a refreshing perspective on persuasion and actually boundary setting by being a woman and saying, no, I'm taking up space and that's okay. It's good for me to take up this space and, you know, be appreciative of the fact that other people can give me that.
Back in my radio days, my show team and I were called into a meeting with the sales and promotions department, and we were challenged to come up with a 3-week-long promotion for an new advertiser that would work on our show. And because our show was edgy, and usually advertisers don't love to be associated with edgy content, that was always a challenge. So my meeting was myself and my 3 guys from my team, my on-air sidekick, Chuck Nice, who I mentioned was a brilliant comedian, and my 2 producers. Chuck was a great guy. He elevated everything we did on the air. He was hilarious and smart. Off the air, he was useless. He contributed nothing. He slept through meetings. He never showed up on time. Right? He was worthless in that way. But for all his shortcomings, I adored him because he just made the show better. So this meeting is going on, and we can't come up with the right idea. And finally, Chuck gets up, takes a deep breath, puts his arms out, stands with his feet shoulder width apart, and says, I got it. Well, we all turn and look because we're dying for an idea. And he proceeds to lay out a positively idiotic idea. I can immediately think of 2 reasons why it won't work. One is logistical and one is legal. Jessica, it is illegal to do what he's saying. So Chuck delivers this idea, though, with such confidence. It's like the words were dripping off the lips of Jesus Christ himself. And I glance around the room and I see all these experienced media people nodding along in agreement. So now this idiocy is our working premise. So I chose not to expose Chuck's idea in the meeting for the lame brain idea it was, because I want my people to bleed for me so I don't embarrass them in public. But we get back to the office and I shut the door and I say, Chuck, that idea was moronic. And I tell him why. And he thinks about it for a second and he says, oh yeah, you're probably right, but what the hell, that meeting needed to end anyway. Not a sliver of embarrassment or shame. And to my knowledge, no one ever came back to him later and said, Chuck, that was messed up. What were you thinking? There were no consequences at all. And I will grant you that would not happen to a woman, okay? Most likely there would be consequences to her. But again, fairness is not my game. Persuasion is my game. And I learned from the prism of persuasion, that was a seminal moment for me. I'm not advocating that women spit out idiotic ideas, but I learned a lot about delivery and commitment and taking up space and unbridled confidence and just how ridiculously far it will take you. Rarely will you see a woman deliver an idea, even a brilliant idea, with that kind of unflappability displayed by my sidekick, Chuck Nice.
So how can women do that? Like, what's the one top thing you'd say as a persuasion, let's not say guru, because that's just a horrible word recently, but as a persuasion expert, what would be the one thing that women could do to deliver ideas with panache?
Well, I would, the number one would be, I'm going to say 2. The first one is what we mentioned before about taking up space. Center yourself, take up space. I plant my feet shoulder width apart. and my arms are bent, but my palms are up or they're loosely gripped together, and I stay rooted. I don't sway back and forth. By the way, it took me years to adopt this posture, years, because my natural way of standing was to stand with my arms crossed. Even though I read everything that said it looks closed off and defensive and weak, I didn't believe it because I didn't feel closed off and defensive or weak. But in recent years, I've made a conscious effort to stop folding my arms and stand rooted in the way that I described to you. And please believe me when I tell you that it has made a difference. I get more respect and attention and deference from all kinds of human beings by just the posture. The other thing is controlling your nerves. And this is a problem, male or female, by the way. It's a universal problem. I won't take up your time with it now, but I will tell you that there are two kinds of speakers: the ones that get nervous and the ones that are liars. Everybody gets nervous. Everybody gets nervous, especially when they're in a critical presentation, whatever that might be. It's too long to tell, but I have a wonderful story of my own about myself and Howard Stern. Have you heard of Howard Stern across the pond?
Yes,
right, so
I have.
Yeah, so we're represented by the same agent, a big, powerful agent, and we were both tasked with roasting him at his 70th birthday party. And I was nervous. There was only a handful of roasters, myself, Howard Stern, another radio person, and an actor. And I was nervous, and I presume that I was the only one who was so nervous that I couldn't eat. You know, I thought I was going to puke. But the other radio person got so nervous that he couldn't do it. He bailed out at the last minute. And Howard Stern, I found out later at the bar when I sat and talked to him, was also nervous as well. And if you can imagine, I mean, Howard Stern is one of the most experienced communicators of all time. So we're all put in positions where we're nervous. And it's just like walking outside in the winter. It's going to be cold, right? It just comes with the territory. So if you can get to the point where you take it as a given that the nerves will be there, but not fixate on them and not fight them. It takes too much mental energy to fight that. Just assume that the nerves will be there. You'll get over them more quickly, and you'll get into your rhythm much more quickly when you're speaking to people.
I love that. Thank you so much for today. Honestly, I could listen to you just forever. You are one of those people who has had such an interesting time in the business world, but has so much value to add, and I hope that all of the poddies listening, women and men, that you are taking notes on this, because it has been genuinely phenomenal. I now am going to go and rearrange my posture for my next speaking gig. So there we go, that's going to be on my list. If you see me at a speaking event near you soon, make sure that you're telling me if I'm not doing those things, if my posture isn't good, or if my palms are down, or if I'm closed off. You come up to me and tell me. But where can people find you if they want to know more about what you're teaching around persuasion, how they can be more persuasive in an ethical way? Where can they find you?
LeslieGoldSpeaker.com. Leslie Gold, like the color, speaker.com is the best way to find me.
Oh, I love it. That's awesome. So there you go, guys. If you have enjoyed this episode, which I know that you will have done, make sure that you hit us up on social media and let us know how we did today, because it's really, really good for us to know when we're hitting the mark. But also, if you are interested in persuasion and in developing more persuasion or more persuasive skills, then make sure you head over to Leslie's website. So we've got that link in the show notes for you. Thank you so much, Leslie, for coming on. Honestly, it's been a privilege.
Jessica, thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it completely. I really appreciate your time and your listeners' time.
You're so welcome. And guys, I will see you in Monday's episode.